Hello, I'm Dr. Irene Jolson, professor of the School of Nursing and Health Studies at Georgetown University. Today, I'm going to be talking about diversity in the classroom very specifically. Our concept of diversity here at Georgetown University is that it is a strength. Indeed, it's a strength that should be not just addressed, but embraced. And this is based, as you might imagine, on our nursing values. And at this point, you will have learned something about our nursing values at Georgetown. This is a conceptual framework that we developed about 6 or 7 years ago, and that serves as a foundation for all of our nursing education here at School of Nursing and Health Studies, and includes, for example, the taking into account human flourishing and respect for others. This is a very important foundation for what we're going to talk about today with regard to diversity. So, what is diversity? We're going to start with that as a consideration. And later we're going to talk about what you think are your definitions for diversity. So initially, the term diversity has been around for some time, as you might imagine. Initially, one thought of diversity in terms of primarily two categories, gender and race or ethnicity. What's important in the last 20 years, and to some extent more frequently in the last 10 years, is that we're thinking in much broader terms than just those two categories, which is important for several reasons. One, because we're recognizing the strength of diversity with regard to other characteristics that we have. And two, because we are not homogeneous within our distinct groups. So women and men are different, of course, but they're not just women and men. They're composites of multiple parts of themselves, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The same is true for Caucasians or African Americans or Latinas or Asian Americans. We're all a very complex mixture of multiple parts of ourselves. What are those characteristics that make up ourselves as individuals? It's our religion, multiple religions in the United States, increasingly so over the last 20-25 years, where we grew up in rural urban areas, large cities, megacities, small cities, geographic region, north, south, east, west, Midwest. Our family structure, if we grew up in a nuclear family, traditional mother, father, 1.6 children now, I believe it is, single family, head of household, extended family, living with aunts and uncles and multiple cousins, etc. What generation we are in the U.S. Are we first generation? Did we come here as immigrants ourselves? Are we second generation? Our parents were here. Third generation, grandparents came here. Or did our ancestors come here 200 years ago or more? What our interests are. Do we have particular interests outside of the obvious interest in nursing and nursing education? Do we have particular interests? What are physical and mental abilities? So we are all composites of these various characteristics. Each of us is unique. So each of us, because we have so many diverse characteristics, is unique. The purpose of this lecture is not to talk about our DNA structure and the genetic parts of us, but rather those other characteristics that make up ourselves as individuals. Interestingly, diversity is difficult to define. And perhaps that's a good thing, because if we look at definitions from, say, 20-25 years ago, we would find those two categories primarily that we talked about, gender and race ethnicity. In fact, in 2007, the Society of Human Resources Management found that only 30% of human resources managers in private companies and in government agencies indicated that their company, their organization, had an official, quote-unquote, definition of diversity. Indeed, what they said is that there are wide variations. So some of them included age, gender, race, ethnicity. Some included sexual orientation, some didn't. Some included veteran status, some didn't, etc. The finding of that report was that, in fact, the concept of diversity was increasingly going beyond the legally protected categories to consider the whole individual. This is a very important development and has implications, of course, for you as a nursing educator and indeed for you as a clinician. So it's important to think outside of the traditional categories, recognizing the added complexities of ourselves as individuals for a number of reasons. And I'll tell you a story to give you an example. Some years ago, 19 years ago in fact, there was a federal agency that commissioned a report on treatment for women who are addicted to alcohol and other drugs. And several of us were asked to review the draft report. For that time, nearly a generation ago, the agency thought it was very forward-thinking. So it included a general chapter on women and addiction, and it also included several specific chapters related to categories of women. So there was a chapter on African American women, a chapter on Latina women, a chapter on Asian American, and a chapter on Native American women. And it included a chapter on lesbians and bisexual women. When two of us read this book, we were rather stunned because the way that each of those chapters described the women, the assumption was that essentially all African American women were the same. All Latina women were the same. All lesbians and bisexual women were the same, which is hardly the case. So we strongly encourage the agency to really significantly revise the report and to take into consideration the fact that we are much more than just the single category in which we might normally be put. This was rather an eye-opening for the agency, and they recognize that when doing so, that is, when taking into account the fact that we're not just fit into one particular category, that there's a broader understanding of what our needs are, in this case, women in treatment for addiction to alcohol and other drugs. What I'd like you to do now is to stop just for a moment to think about how you define diversity. When you think of the term diversity, what comes to your mind? What do you imagine about an individual or group of individuals? So think about that, and why don't you write it down quickly? Just write down the first ideas that come to your mind about what you think diversity means, what it is. You might want to continue this later after this discussion. So I'm going to tell you now examples of definitions of diversity that resulted from an exercise conducted among undergraduate university students a few years ago. And I think it shows us the wide range that people are considering when they talk about diversity. These are quotes from the students. Diversity is anything that sets one individual apart from another. Diversity is openness to differences among people, cultures, and perspectives. Diversity is having a multitude of people from different backgrounds and cultures together in the same environment, working for the same goals. Diversity is a satisfying mix of ideas, cultures, races, genders, economic status, and other characteristics necessary for promoting growth and learning among a group. Diversity is the immersion and comprehensive integration of various cultures, experiences, and people. Diversity is perspectives, views, and thoughts on issues, as well as diversity of background, where one lives, as well as one's life experiences. And finally, diversity is not tolerance for difference, but inclusion of those who are not the majority. It should not be measured as a count or fraction. That is somehow demeaning. Success at maintaining diversity would be when we no longer ask if we are diverse enough, because it has become the norm, not remarkable. So reflect on these definitions that students developed a few years ago, and then reflect on your own. Continue to reflect on your own. A definition that we might consider that has been adapted from another one developed by the University of Oregon is the following. The concept of diversity encompasses acceptance and respect. It means understanding that each individual is unique and recognizing our individual differences. These can be along the dimensions such as race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, geographic areas of origin, primary language spoken in the home, socioeconomic status, age, physical and mental abilities, religious beliefs, political beliefs, or other ideologies. Importantly, each individual is a combination of these dimensions, as we've discussed before. Considering and respecting diversity entails exploring these differences in a safe, positive, and nurturing environment, understanding each other and moving beyond simple tolerance to embracing and celebrating the rich dimensions of diversity contained within each individual. Let's reflect for a moment on why that's important for you as nursing educators. Consider that for a minute. You might want to jot down your ideas. It's important because when we enter a classroom, the first day of a semester, we're faced with 10 or 15 or 30 or 40 or 100 or more students. And each one of them is unique. Each one of them brings to the classroom an extraordinary combination of experience, physical characteristics, other characteristics that result in possibly a melting pot within that classroom. Of course, each student should be considered as a distinct individual, but each of them makes up part of a group that will continue through the course of a semester. Let's step back for a minute and talk about learning styles as one aspect of diversity in the classroom. This is, of course, extremely important, and you will learn about learning styles in one of your other courses. For now, we're going to reflect on learning styles in the context of diversity. Because again, when you walk into the classroom for the first time in a semester, there will be students with a wide variety of learning styles. Now, there are many different ways to categorize learning styles. We're going to look at three of them, three different ways to categorize them, and think about what the differences are, and then discuss some ideas about how to address them as a nursing educator. The first way to categorize learning styles is in terms of active and reflective learning. Quite different styles. So active learners retain and understand information best by doing something active with it, discussing it, applying it, or even explaining it to others. They tend to like group work. They tend not to like sitting through lectures. It's much more difficult for them. Reflective learners prefer to think about information quietly and alone first. They don't enjoy group work. They much prefer to work alone. Most of us, in point of fact, are a combination of active and reflective learners, although we have tendencies to one or the other learning style. The second category is sensing and intuitive. So those who have the sensing style like learning facts, problem solving, using well-established methods. They dislike complications and surprises. They're very patient with details. They're very, very detail-oriented. And they're very good at memorizing facts and doing hands-on work. They love working in the laboratory. They tend to be more practical and careful, and they need connections with the real world. However, they resent being tested on material not covered in the classroom. Intuitive learners prefer discovering possibilities and relationships. They like innovation. They dislike repetition. They're better at grasping new concepts and more comfortable with abstractions and mathematics than are the sensing students. They tend to work faster and be more innovative, and they don't like memorization and routine. The third category comprises visual and verbal learners. So Many of you have heard of this, I'm sure. Visual learners like diagrams and flowcharts and graphs and timelines, and films and demonstration. And verbal learners get much more out of spoken and written words and explanations. Most people are in the visual category, and there's some research to indicate that increasingly, as we become a more visual society with information and communication technology, that people are moving more and more into the category of visual learners. But there still are many people who are within the verbal category. Most people learn when information is presented both visually and verbally. So as we're moving into becoming a more visual society, it's important not to forget that we need the verbal and written as well. So how do you address these differences, this diversity? Firstly, it's important to point out that we are all both active or reflective learners, sensing or intuitive learners, and visual or verbal learners. So again, we're composites of many different characteristics. So when you're in the classroom for the first time, it's important in the first couple of sessions to try to discern the different learning styles among your students, to recognize who the students might be, and to engage in pedagogy that recognizes these differences, which is to say, to ensure that you have both hands-on active learning techniques and others that take into account those who prefer to work alone independently, for example. To have in-class activities and individual assignments, and to provide guidance for students to assist them in learning and using the best of all possible mechanisms to ensure that they're building on their particular strengths. For active learners, for example, you would have group activities, and for reflective learners, have activities that include reviewing and writing short summaries of readings or class notes. In addition to learning styles, there are interaction styles. Some of us are simply more verbose, more engaging, more interactive than others. And we need to take into account that diffidence, that shyness is a fine characteristic. It's just not the same as being verbose, loquacious. One way to address, let me step back for a minute. In so much of the work that we do as nursing educators, participation, engagement with other students, engagement in the classroom is very, very important part of the learning process, and indeed is part of the grading process. That's not likely to change. What we can do is help the student who's diffident and quiet, who's shy, to take advantage of resources that are available and to engage that student. Two suggestions. One is to ensure that there's a balance in the ability for students to engage and participate in class discussion, to actually set rules essentially regarding respect in the classroom. And that includes allowing time for others to speak and participate. The second is to offer students in the first couple of sessions of the class, when you perceive that a student is particularly shy or diffident, to offer to that student to meet with them individually a few days before the class to discuss the readings, the topics to be covered in the class, so that he or she can actually practice participation. This may seem a little bit out of the ordinary, but some of us here at Georgetown have used that technique quite successfully. And what tends to happen is that students in the first few weeks, first month or so after they start this process, will begin to get accustomed to asking questions. In the first place, they always have done the readings several days before the class. And then they begin to feel comfortable with actually asking a question or two, making a comment or two about the materials. And by the end of the semester, they're participating at nearly the same or the same level as those who are much more actively engaged and more verbose and less shy. So this is a technique that helps to take into consideration that type of diversity of interacting styles. Let's go back and think a bit about the demographic and other diversity characteristics and how to handle them in the classroom. Racial, ethnic, and country of origin diversity is extremely important. You've heard quite a bit about that. That's the diversity category that's probably the most discussed in addition to gender. So we won't belabor that now. Religious spiritual diversity is very important and may be one of the most difficult to take into account. We at Georgetown, as you know, are a Jesuit university. We are also extremely proud of our not just embracing, but celebrating the religious diversity that's on the campus and that's represented by those of you who are students from afar. Indeed, Georgetown has a very specific policy that allows for students to let the professor know at the beginning of the semester what his or her religious holidays are, and to arrange with the professor to ensure that any assignments that are due are addressed if that student will not be in the class or not be participating or able to submit, in the case of distance learning, able to submit the assignment on time. So we take this very, very, very seriously, religious diversity at Georgetown. Something else that not just addresses the need, recognizes the need for the student to adhere to one's religious practices, but also really kind of celebrates the practices, is that some of us at School of Nursing and Health Studies will identify in the beginning of the semester what the religious holidays are represented by the students in the class. Will identify even what some ways of greeting during that religious holiday are, and actually will use those terms when the holiday comes along. So that conveys to the student the message that his or her religion is to be celebrated and is recognized. Abilities, physical and mental health abilities, are another category of diversity that's quite talked about. We like to think here at Georgetown that we go far beyond the Americans with Disabilities Act and assist the students in not just the learning process at Georgetown, but for in terms of lifelong learning. It's important to take advantage of the policies in the institution in which, when you're nursing educators, whatever that academic institution is, or if you're a nursing educator in a health facility, what the policies are at that facility, that clinical facility. Each institution definitely has policies with respect to special needs, and you need to, of course, adhere to those, be mindful of those and adhere to them, and importantly, let the students know that you do that. So in virtually all of the syllabi that we create in the School of Nursing and Health Studies, we include a paragraph that specifically stipulates what our policy is with regard to addressing special needs, including learning needs of the student. And then if possible, going beyond that to ensure that individuals with special needs, to ensure that those needs are addressed. So let's step back and reflect on, again, why this is important. Why are we even addressing diversity as part of the master's program in nursing education? Because if you look around in a classroom, in a physical classroom, you look around at the faces on the screens when you're participating in distance learning, you'll see quite a bit of diversity. You'll see even more diversity when you're in the clinical setting. So patients, clinicians, administrative personnel are all diverse. Here at Georgetown, we like to say that we walk across the parking lot at Georgetown to the hospital, that immediately it's so clear that Georgetown actually represents essentially global diversity. So people from every continent are patients, clinicians, and administrative personnel. Multiple languages are spoken. Multiple cultures are represented. And so nursing educators are helping nurses to prepare to meet the needs of those patients, and to work with other clinicians, and to work as a team with administrative personnel. There's a wonderful article that talks about ethics and the importance of ethics. The title is Ethics Pays. We here at the School of Nursing and Health Studies like to believe that appreciating, embracing, welcoming diversity really is all about respect for others, and encouraging human flourishing, back to the nursing values we discussed before. And ultimately, that respect for others pays. Thank you very much.